The early morning mist clung to the valley like a threadbare blanket, and Maria Elena Vasquez pressed herself against the rough bark of an apple tree, her small fingers already stained purple from the overripe fruit she had been collecting before dawn. At 14, she had learned to move like a shadow through the orchards that bordered their ramshackle neighborhood, taking only what others had deemed worthless: the bruised apples, the ones touched by rot, the fallen fruit that would otherwise feed only the insects and the earth. Behind her, tucked into a canvas bag that had once held her father's tools before the accident, were 17 apples in various stages of decay. She had counted each one carefully, the way she counted everything now: the coins in the mason jar beneath her mattress, the days since their last real meal, the hours until her younger siblings would wake and look at her with those hollow, trusting eyes that said she would somehow make everything better. The sound of approaching footsteps on gravel made her freeze. Through the morning fog, she could make out the silhouette of a man walking purposefully down the dirt road that separated the orchard from the collection of trailers and shacks where she lived. He was tall, wearing a clean white shirt and dark jeans that looked like they had never seen a day of real work, and something about the way he carried himself, straight-backed and unhurried despite the early hour, made her stomach clench with familiar fear. Maria Elena knew the type. They came through sometimes, these well-dressed men with their clipboards and their measuring tools and their talk of development and progress. They looked at places like hers and saw opportunity, but never the people who would be displaced when that opportunity came calling. She had heard the adults whispering about surveys and land assessments, about companies from the city that wanted to build shopping centers where their homes now stood. She shifted her weight carefully, trying to make herself even smaller against the tree trunk. The bag of apples felt impossibly heavy now, and she was acutely aware of every sound: the rustle of her clothing, the soft thud of an apple shifting against another. Even her own breathing seemed loud enough to give her away. Getting caught stealing, even stealing what others had thrown away, would mean questions she couldn't answer and attention she couldn't afford. The man stopped walking. Maria Elena held her breath and watched as he turned slowly, scanning the orchard with dark eyes that seemed to miss nothing. For a moment that felt like an eternity, his gaze passed over the tree where she hid, and she was certain he had seen her. But then he continued his survey of the surrounding area, taking in the neat rows of apple trees, the distant mountains still shrouded in morning haze, and the cluster of weathered buildings where smoke was just beginning to rise from a few chimneys as the earliest risers started their day. When he finally resumed walking, Maria Elena waited until his footsteps faded completely before she dared to move. She clutched the bag of apples close to her chest and ran in a crouch toward home, her bare feet finding the familiar path automatically even as her mind raced with worry about the stranger and what his presence might mean for her family. The cluster of homes where she lived couldn't generously be called a neighborhood. It was more like a collection of afterthoughts, trailers that had been parked here temporarily decades ago and never moved, small houses built from whatever materials their occupants could scrounge or afford, and a few structures that defied easy categorization altogether. Her own home was a single-wide trailer that her grandfather had somehow acquired in the 1960s, and that had been patched and repatched so many times that it was hard to tell what color it had originally been painted. She slipped quietly through the front door, wincing as the hinges squeaked despite her efforts to open it slowly. Inside, the familiar smell of too many people in too small a space mingled with the lingering aroma of last night's dinner: beans and rice stretched with whatever vegetables she had been able to find or trade for. The main room served as kitchen, dining area, and living space all at once, and through the thin walls, she could hear the soft breathing of her 3 younger siblings still asleep in the back bedroom they all shared. Maria Elena moved quickly to the small kitchenette and began sorting through the apples by the light filtering through windows that probably hadn't been properly clean in years. The worst ones, the ones that were more brown than anything else, would need to be used first. She could cut away the bad parts and make them into a sauce that would help stretch their meager breakfast. The ones that were merely bruised could be saved for later in the day, maybe baked into something that would smell good enough to make the children forget how little they actually had to eat. As she worked, carefully paring away the damaged portions of fruit with a knife that had seen better decades, Maria Elena let her mind wander to the arithmetic that governed their daily existence. $3.47 in the mason jar, enough for maybe 2 more days of the cheapest food she could find if she was very careful and very lucky. After that, she would need to find work again, which was always a challenge for someone her age who couldn't afford to be too particular about the conditions or the pay. The sound of stirring from the back bedroom meant that Carlos was waking up. At 11, he was the oldest of her siblings and the one who most understood their situation, though she did her best to shield him from the worst of it. Behind him would come Honor at 9, and little Miguel, who had just turned 6 and still believed that things would get better soon because Maria Elena had told him so. Mija, Carlos's voice was heavy with sleep as he appeared in the doorway, his dark hair sticking up at impossible angles and his clothes wrinkled from being slept in. They had learned to sleep in their clothes during the winter months when the trailer's heating system worked sporadically at best, and the habit had persisted even as the weather warmed. "What are you making?" "Apple sauce," she said, trying to inject more enthusiasm into her voice than she felt. "I found some good ones this morning. There'll be enough for everyone to have some with breakfast." Carlos nodded and moved to help her without being asked, taking over the careful work of cutting away the spoiled portions while she started heating water in their single working pot. They had developed this routine over the months since their father's accident, a choreographed dance of cooperation that allowed them to stretch their resources and take care of Ana and Miguel without making it obvious how precarious their situation really was. The accident had happened on a construction site 8 months ago. A scaffold collapse that broke 3 of their father's ribs and damaged his back badly enough that he couldn't work anymore. The workers' compensation had lasted exactly 6 weeks before the paperwork got too complicated and the payments stopped coming. Their mother had left when Miguel was still a baby, overwhelmed by the responsibility and the poverty that seemed to follow their family like a persistent shadow. Since then, it had been their father trying to support 4 children on whatever odd jobs his increasingly fragile health would allow, supplemented by Maria Elena's wages from cleaning houses and watching other people's children. After the accident, their father had tried to continue working, but the pain medication made him unreliable, and the physical limitations meant he couldn't do the kind of labor that was readily available to someone without education or connections. He had grown increasingly despondent as their savings dwindled and then disappeared entirely, and 3 weeks ago, he had simply vanished. No note, no explanation, just there one day and gone the next, leaving behind only a pile of unpaid bills and 4 children who had no one else to depend on. "Is Papa coming back today?" Anna's voice was small and hopeful as she emerged from the bedroom, her long hair tangled and her favorite dress, the only one that still fit her properly, wrinkled from sleep. "I don't know, Mija," Maria Elena said softly, the same answer she had been giving for 21 days now. "But we're doing fine without him for now." It was a lie, of course, but it was a necessary one. Ana and Miguel needed to believe that their world was still stable, that the adults in their lives had everything under control. Carlos knew better, but he had taken on the role of co-conspirator in maintaining the illusion for the younger ones. They were all growing up too fast, but Maria Elena was determined to preserve what remained of their childhood for as long as possible. Miguel appeared last, rubbing his eyes with small fists and immediately gravitating toward Maria Elena the way he had since he was tiny. At 6, he was still young enough to accept reassurance at face value, to believe that his big sister could fix anything that went wrong. The trust in his dark eyes was both a comfort and a terrible responsibility that sometimes kept her awake at night, staring at the ceiling and trying to figure out how to make their impossible situation work for just one more day. "What's that smell?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her legs and peering up at the pot where the apples were beginning to break down into sauce. "Breakfast," she said, smoothing his hair with one hand while stirring with the other. "It's going to be good today." The apple sauce, when it was finished, was actually quite good despite its humble origins. Mixed with a little of the brown sugar she had been hoarding and served over the last of their white rice, it made a meal that felt more substantial than the sum of its parts. The children ate eagerly, and Maria Elena allowed herself a moment of satisfaction at having provided something that brought genuine smiles to their faces. But even as they ate and chattered about their plans for the day, Carlos wanted to explore the creek that ran behind the orchard. Ana was hopping to finish a book she had borrowed from the small library in town. Miguel just wanted to play with the collection of bottle caps that served as his primary toys. Maria Elena's mind kept returning to the stranger she had seen that morning. Something about his presence felt significant, though she couldn't articulate why. After breakfast, She sent the children outside to play in the small area behind their trailer where previous tenants had attempted to create a yard by scattering some grass seed over the hard-packed dirt. It wasn't much, but it was safe and contained, and it allowed them to be children for a while without worrying about the larger world that seemed increasingly hostile to their existence. Alone in the trailer, Maria Elena allowed herself to confront the reality of their situation without the need to maintain a brave face. $3.47, maybe 2 days of food if she was careful. After that, she would need to find work quickly, or they would have to make some very difficult decisions about their future. She had been avoiding the obvious solution because it terrified her more than hunger did. The state would take care of them, certainly. There were systems in place for children in their situation, foster homes and institutions where they would have regular meals and clean clothes and supervision. But they would also be separated, scattered to different homes across the county or even the state, and Maria Elena couldn't bear the thought of Miguel waking up in a strange place and calling for her when she wouldn't be there to answer. The sound of a vehicle pulling up outside interrupted her dark thoughts. Through the small window above the kitchen sink, she could see a pickup truck that looked expensive and well-maintained, completely out of place among the collection of aging cars and trucks that belonged to their neighbors. Her stomach dropped as she recognized the driver, the same man she had seen walking through the orchard that morning. Maria Elena quickly moved away from the window and tried to calm her racing heart. Maybe he was just lost. Maybe he was looking for someone else entirely. Maybe he hadn't seen her that morning after all, and this was just an unfortunate coincidence that would resolve itself when he realized he had the wrong address. The knock on the door was firm but not aggressive, the kind of knock that suggested someone who was used to being answered but didn't feel the need to be threatening about it. Maria Elena waited, hoping he would go away if she didn't respond. But after a moment, the knock came again, accompanied by a voice that was deep and surprisingly gentle. "Hello, I'm looking for the Vasquez family. I'd like to speak with someone if possible." There was no point in pretending they weren't home. The children's voices were clearly audible from the backyard, and smoke was still rising from their small chimney where she had burned the apple peels and cores. Maria Elena took a deep breath and opened the door just wide enough to see out, keeping one hand on the frame and positioning herself to close it quickly if necessary. The man was older than she had thought, maybe 50 or so, with graying hair and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners as if he smiled frequently. He was holding a worn leather folder and had the easy stance of someone who spent a lot of time outdoors. Despite her fear, something about him seemed genuine in a way that surprised her. "I'm Maria Elena Vasquez," she said carefully, not opening the door any wider. "What do you want?" "My name is David Morrison," he said, and his voice carried a slight accent that she couldn't quite place. "I own the orchard where you've been collecting apples." Maria Elena's heart stopped. This was it, she was caught, and now everything would fall apart. The children would be taken away, she would face charges for theft, and all her efforts to keep their family together would be for nothing. She started to close the door, but his next words stopped her. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said quickly. "I'm here because I think we might be able to help each other." Something in his tone made her pause. She had expected anger or threats or the cold satisfaction of someone who had caught a thief red-handed. Instead, he sounded almost sad, like he understood something about her situation that she hadn't expected anyone to see. "I don't understand," she said, though she didn't open the door any further. "The apples you've been taking," David Morrison said carefully, "they're not really stolen. We don't harvest the damaged fruit. It's not worth the cost of labor to collect something we can't sell. Usually it just rots on the ground. You're actually doing us a favor by cleaning it up." Maria Elena stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. It sounded too good to be true, and her experience had taught her to be deeply suspicious of anything that sounded too good to be true. "Then why are you here?" she asked. David Morrison shifted the folder in his hands and looked past her toward the sound of the children playing in the backyard. When he spoke again, his voice was even gentler than before. "Because I've been watching you for several weeks now, and I think you're exactly the kind of person I've been looking for. Someone responsible, someone who works hard, someone who takes care of their family no matter what it costs them personally." "I don't understand what you're talking about," Maria Elena said, but something in her chest was starting to flutter with what might have been hope. "I have a proposition for you," David Morrison said. A job opportunity that comes with housing and benefits and the chance for your whole family to stay together. But first, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Maria Elena waited, every muscle in her body tense and ready to run if necessary. Are you alone here? Are you taking care of your siblings by yourself? The question hung in the air between them like a bridge she could either cross or burn. Telling the truth meant admitting that they had no adult supervision, that she was a minor trying to care for three younger children with no resources and no support. It meant exposing their vulnerability to someone who could destroy what little stability they had managed to create. But looking into David Morrison's eyes, seeing the genuine concern there, Maria Elena made a decision that would change everything. "Yes," she said quietly, "it's just us." David Morrison nodded slowly, as if her answer confirmed something he had already suspected. He looked around at their modest surroundings, taking in the patched trailer and the struggling attempts at a garden and the children's voices drifting from the backyard. And when he spoke again, there was a quality of determination in his voice that made Maria Elena believe that maybe, just maybe, their luck was about to change. "Then I think we need to talk," he said. "All of us. Would you be willing to gather your siblings so I can explain what I'm offering?" Maria Elena looked at this stranger who claimed to own the orchard where she had been stealing food to keep her family alive. This man who spoke of job opportunities and keeping families together, and found herself nodding before she could second-guess the decision. As she called to Carlos, Ana, and Miguel to come inside, she couldn't shake the feeling that this moment would be one she would remember for the rest of her life. The moment when everything changed, when a desperate girl's early morning theft of moldy apples led to something she had never dared to hope for. The children gathered around the small table, their eyes wide and curious as they looked at the stranger who had appeared in their home. David Morrison sat across from them, his large frame somehow managing not to seem threatening despite taking up most of the available space in their tiny living area. "First," he said, looking directly at Maria Elena, "I want you to know that none of you are in any trouble. What you've been doing, taking care of your family, finding ways to make sure everyone eats, keeping your siblings safe and together, that takes more strength and character than most adults ever have to show." Miguel scooted closer to Maria Elena, still uncertain about this stranger, but Carlos and Ana were listening intently, old enough to sense that something important was happening. "Now," David Morrison continued, "let me tell you about my ranch." David Morrison's ranch stretched across 3,000 acres of rolling hills and fertile valleys, a landscape so vast and beautiful that it seemed like something from a dream to children who had spent their lives in a cramped trailer, surrounded by other people's cast-offs. As their borrowed pickup truck wound up the dirt road that led to the main house, Maria Elena pressed her face to the window and tried to take in everything at once. The endless fields where cattle grazed peacefully, the neat rows of fruit trees that seemed to go on forever, the distant mountains that formed a dramatic backdrop to this kingdom of plenty. "Is this really where we're going to live?" Anna whispered, her voice filled with the same wonder that Maria Elena felt but was trying hard not to show. At 14, she had learned to be suspicious of good fortune, especially when it appeared suddenly and without explanation. "We'll see," Maria Elena replied carefully, though her heart was pounding with something that might have been hope. The conversation in their trailer 3 days ago had been like something from a fairy tale, a strange man appearing at their door with an offer that seemed too generous to be real. David Morrison had explained that his ranch was struggling not because of money or land or resources, but because of people. His previous ranch manager had retired 6 months ago, and the series of replacements he had hired since then had proven unreliable, dishonest, or simply unwilling to put in the kind of careful, dedicated work that an operation of this size required. Meanwhile, his house manager, the woman who had overseen the cooking, cleaning, and general maintenance of the ranch's main house, had moved to Phoenix to be closer to her grandchildren, leaving him trying to manage both the business side of ranching and the practical details of daily life. "What I need," he had said, looking directly at Maria Elena with those serious dark eyes, "is someone I can trust, someone who understands that taking care of things, land, animals, people, is serious work that requires dedication and integrity, someone who has already proven they can make sacrifices for the people they care about." The job he was offering was unlike anything Maria Elena could have imagined. She would serve as his assistant ranch manager, learning the business side of running a cattle operation while also overseeing the daily management of the main house. In exchange, her family would live in the ranch's guest house, a structure that, from his description, was larger and more comfortable than any place they had ever called home. The children would attend the local school, which was small but well-funded and had a reputation for excellence. And the salary he mentioned was more money than Maria Elena had ever seen at one time, enough to not only cover their basic needs, but to begin building the kind of security she had never dared to dream about. But the offer had come with conditions that made her nervous. They would need to live on the ranch, isolated from the small community they had known all their lives. She would be working for a man she barely knew, trusting him with her siblings' safety and future. And most unsettling of all, there was something about David Morrison's offer that felt too generous, too perfectly suited to their desperate situation, as if he knew more about their circumstances than he was admitting. "There's the house," Carlos said, pointing ahead to where the dirt road curved around a small hill. "Look at the size of it." The main house was indeed impressive, a sprawling structure of wood and stone that looked like it had grown naturally from the landscape around it. It wasn't ostentatious in the way that rich people's houses sometimes were in movies, but it was clearly the home of someone who had both money and good taste. Wide porches wrapped around multiple sides of the building, and large windows reflected the afternoon sun like welcoming eyes. But it was the smaller building nestled about 50 yards away that made Maria Elena's breath catch in her throat. The guest house was modest compared to the main residence, but it was still larger than any place she had ever lived. It had a real front porch with actual rocking chairs, windows that looked like they had been cleaned recently, and a yard where children could play without worrying about broken glass or dangerous debris. "This is going to be our house?" Miguel asked, his 6-year-old voice filled with amazement. He had been quiet for most of the drive, overwhelmed by the dramatic change in their circumstances, but the sight of what might become their new home had finally broken through his uncertainty. "If everything works out," Maria Elena said, though she was finding it increasingly difficult to maintain her cautious tone. The place was beautiful, peaceful in a way that made the constant stress of their previous life seem like something from another world. David Morrison parked the truck near the guest house and turned to face them with a smile that seemed genuine. Over the past 3 days, as they had packed their few belongings and prepared to leave the only home the younger children could remember, Maria Elena had watched him carefully for signs of deception or hidden motives. But everything about him, his patience with their questions, his practical approach to solving the logistics of their move, his obvious affection for the land he was entrusting to their care, suggested a man who was exactly what he appeared to be. "Why don't you all take a look around while I get your things from the truck?" he said. "The house is unlocked, and I think you'll find everything you need to get settled." The guest house was a revelation. 3 bedrooms, each larger than the single room all 4 children had shared in the trailer. A kitchen with appliances that looked new and countertops that gleamed in the afternoon sunlight. A living room with actual furniture, not much, but clean and comfortable and theirs to use. Most miraculous of all, 2 full bathrooms, which meant no more waiting in line or worrying about whether there would be hot water left. Ana and Miguel ran from room to room, their excited voices echoing through the empty spaces as they claimed bedrooms and marveled at closets large enough to walk into. Carlos was more reserved, but Maria Elena could see the wonder in his eyes as he examined the solid construction of the walls and the quality of the fixtures. This wasn't temporary housing or charity. This was a real home. "The refrigerator and pantry are stocked with basic supplies," David Morrison said, appearing in the doorway with their few suitcases. "Tomorrow, I'll take you into town to open a bank account and get you set up with everything you'll need for school registration. But for tonight, I thought you might want to just settle in and get comfortable." Maria Elena nodded, still overwhelmed by the generosity of what was being offered. "Mr. Morrison," she began, but he held up a hand to stop her. "David," he said, "if we're going to be working together, we might as well be on a first-name basis. And before you say anything else, I want you to understand something important. This isn't charity. I'm not doing this out of pity or because I feel sorry for your situation. I'm doing it because I think you're exactly the right person for this job, and because I believe this arrangement will benefit all of us." "But why me?" Maria Elena asked, voicing the question that had been nagging at her since their first conversation. "You don't know anything about me. You don't know if I'm reliable or honest or capable of doing the work you're describing. You're taking an enormous risk on someone who was stealing from your orchard just a week ago." David Morrison was quiet for a moment, looking out through the large windows at the rolling pastures where his cattle grazed peacefully in the late afternoon sun. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight of memory that suggested this conversation was more personal than she had realized. 25 years ago, he said slowly, I was working construction in Denver, trying to save enough money to buy a small piece of land where I could raise a few head of cattle. I was living in a room above a garage, eating one meal a day, sending every extra dollar I earned back to my mother in New Mexico because my father had died and left her with nothing. He paused, and Maria Elena found herself leaning forward slightly, drawn into the story despite her uncertainty about where it was leading. One morning, I caught a young boy stealing food from the construction site, lunch someone had brought and left in a cooler. Instead of turning him in, I asked him why he was taking it. Turned out he was trying to feed his little sister because their mother was working 3 jobs and still couldn't make ends meet. David Morrison turned away from the window and looked directly at Maria Elena. That boy's name was Roberto, and instead of punishing him, the site foreman, a man named Frank Kowalski, offered him a job. Roberto started by cleaning up debris and running errands, but Frank saw something in him that other people missed. By the time I left Denver, Roberto was learning electrical work and making enough money to help his family move to a better neighborhood. "What happened to him?" Carlos asked quietly. He had been listening from the doorway, and Maria Elena realized that all 3 of her siblings were now gathered around, drawn by the story. "Roberto Mendez now owns the largest electrical contracting company in Colorado," David Morrison said with obvious pride. "He employs over 200 people, and last year he donated $500,000 to build a community center in the neighborhood where he grew up, all because someone saw past his circumstances to the person he was capable of becoming." The meaning of the story was clear, but Maria Elena still felt compelled to voice her doubts. "That's a beautiful story," she said carefully, "but Roberto was just one person. You're taking on 4 of us, and we don't have any experience with ranching or business management or any of the things you're talking about." "Experience can be taught," David Morrison replied. "Character can't be. And someone who will steal moldy apples to feed her siblings, who will sacrifice her own childhood to keep her family together, who will face down a strange man at her door to protect the people she loves, that person has the kind of character that can't be bought or faked." Miguel, who had been unusually quiet during the conversation, suddenly tugged on Maria Elena's sleeve. "Does this mean we don't have to be hungry anymore?" he asked in a small voice that made her heart break. Before she could answer, David Morrison knelt down to Miguel's eye level. "You will never be hungry again," he said with absolute certainty. "Not while you live on this ranch, that's a promise." The weight of that promise seemed to fill the room, and Maria Elena felt something inside her chest that she barely recognized, the absence of the constant fear that had been her companion for so many months. For the first time since their father's accident, she allowed herself to believe that maybe everything really would be okay. "Now," David Morrison said, standing up and returning to his practical tone, "let me show you around the ranch so you can start understanding what we're working with here." The tour that followed was like a journey through a different world. The ranch was a complex operation that combined cattle raising, fruit cultivation, and what David Morrison called sustainable agriculture practices that were designed to work with the natural environment rather than against it. They walked through the main barn, where dozens of cattle stood in clean, well-maintained stalls. They visited the equipment shed, filled with machinery that looked expensive and well cared for. They climbed a small hill that offered a panoramic view of the entire operation, and David Morrison pointed out the various sections: the grazing areas, the fruit orchards, the vegetable gardens that supplied much of what the ranch consumed. "The goal," he explained as they stood looking out over the landscape, "is to create a system that supports itself. The cattle provide fertilizer for the crops feed the cattle, and everything works together to maintain the health of the land. It's more complicated than traditional ranching, but it's also more profitable and more sustainable in the long term." "How do you learn all of this?" Anna asked. At 9, she was already showing signs of the intellectual curiosity that made her an excellent student, and Maria Elena could see her mind working to understand the complexity of what they were seeing. "Books, mostly," David Morrison admitted, "and a lot of trial and error. I made plenty of mistakes in the beginning, but I learned from each one. That's part of what I'll be teaching Maria Elena, how to see the ranch as a complete system rather than just a collection of separate activities. As they walked back toward the houses in the gathering dusk, Maria Elena found herself thinking about the magnitude of what she was taking on. Managing a household was one thing. She had been doing that out of necessity for months. But learning to help run a business operation of this size and complexity was something entirely different. The responsibility felt overwhelming, especially when she considered how much her siblings' future depended on her success. "I can see you thinking," David Morrison said quietly, falling into step beside her while the children ran ahead toward their new home. "And I can guess what you're thinking about." "How can you be so sure I won't let you down?" Maria Elena asked. "I'm 14 years old. I've never had a real job, never managed anything bigger than a household budget of $20. What if I make mistakes that cost you money or hurt the ranch?" "You will make mistakes," David Morrison said matter-of-factly. "Everyone does, especially in the beginning. The question isn't whether you'll make mistakes, it's what you'll do when you make them. Will you try to hide them and hope no one notices, or will you admit what happened and work to fix it?" It was a fair question, and Maria Elena thought about it seriously as they reached the guest house. "I'd want to fix it," she said finally, "even if it was embarrassing or difficult." "That's the right answer," David Morrison said, "and that's why I know you're going to succeed at this." Inside the guest house, the children had already begun the process of making the space their own. Miguel had discovered a window seat in what would be his bedroom and was arranging his collection of bottle caps on the wide sill. Anna had found the small bookshelf in the living room and was examining the collection of books someone had left behind. Carlos was in the kitchen, opening cabinets and marveling at the abundance of plates, cups, and cooking utensils. "There are so many books," Anna said wonderingly. "Can I read them?" "They're yours now," David Morrison said. "Everything in this house is for your family to use, and when you start school next week, you'll find that the library there has even more books." "School," Maria Elena repeated, suddenly realizing another dimension of their changed circumstances. "I'll need to register all of them, won't I? I mean our paperwork isn't really." "We'll handle that," David Morrison assured her. "I know the principal at the local school, and she's helped other families in unusual circumstances. The important thing is that all three of them will be able to continue their education without any gaps or problems." Education. It was something Maria Elena had almost given up thinking about for herself, but now she realized that her siblings would have opportunities she had never dreamed possible. Anna, who devoured every book she could get her hands on, would be able to learn from real teachers with real resources. Carlos, who had always been good with numbers and practical problems, would have access to science and mathematics instruction that could open doors to careers she couldn't even imagine. And Miguel, who was naturally curious about everything around him, would grow up in an environment where learning was valued and supported. "What about me?" she asked quietly. "I know the job is what's important, but will there be time for me to continue school too?" David Morrison smiled, and she realized it was the first time she had asked about something for herself rather than for her siblings. "The ranch work is seasonal and flexible," he said. "During the busy seasons, you'll be working full-time, but during the quieter months, there's no reason you couldn't finish your education. There are also correspondence courses and online programs that might work well with your schedule." As the evening progressed and David Morrison prepared to leave them to settle into their new home, Maria Elena found herself standing on the front porch, looking out at a landscape that was now somehow theirs to call home. The stars were beginning to appear in a sky that seemed larger and clearer than any she had ever seen, and the air carried the clean scent of growing things and open spaces. "Maria Elena," David Morrison said, appearing beside her with a manila envelope in his hand. "Before I forget, there's something else I need to give you." Inside the envelope was more money than she had ever seen at one time. Enough, David Morrison explained, to cover any immediate expenses they might have, to buy clothes for school, and to begin building an emergency fund so they would never again face the kind of desperate circumstances that had driven her to steal apples in the pre-dawn darkness. "This is an advance on your first month's salary," he said, "but I want you to understand that it's not a loan. It's yours to use however you think best for your family." Maria Elena stared at the money, overwhelmed by the generosity and by the trust it represented. "I don't know how to thank you," she said finally. "Don't thank me yet," David Morrison replied with a slight smile. Wait until you've been here a few months and you're dealing with sick cattle and broken equipment and all the other challenges that come with ranch life. Then decide whether you still think this was a good deal. After he left, Maria Elena sat on the front porch for a long time, listening to her siblings settling into their new bedrooms and trying to process everything that had happened. 3 weeks ago, she had been stealing rotting fruit to keep her family from starving. Tonight, she was the assistant manager of a 3,000-acre ranch, responsible not only for her siblings' welfare, but for helping to run a business operation that represented someone else's life's work. The weight of that responsibility was enormous, but for the first time in months, it felt like a weight she could bear. More than that, it felt like a challenge she was eager to meet. Tomorrow would bring new lessons, new problems to solve, and new opportunities to prove that David Morrison's faith in her was justified. Inside the house, she could hear Miguel calling her name softly, wanting her to come see how his bottle caps looked arranged on the window seat. Anna was reading aloud to herself from one of the books she had discovered, her voice carrying the kind of contentment that had been absent from their lives for far too long. Carlos was humming quietly as he explored the kitchen, already planning the kind of meals they would be able to prepare with access to real cooking equipment and adequate ingredients. As Maria Elena stood up to go inside and help her siblings finish settling into their new life, she thought about the chain of events that had brought them to this moment. If their father hadn't had the accident, if she hadn't been driven to desperation, if she hadn't been brave enough or foolish enough to steal apples from a stranger's orchard, if David Morrison hadn't been the kind of man who saw potential rather than problems when he looked at a frightened girl trying to feed her family, if any of those things had been different, they would still be trapped in that cycle of poverty and fear that had consumed their lives. Instead, they were here, in a place where Miguel would never again have to ask if he would be hungry, where Anna could read as many books as she wanted, where Carlos could go to school and learn about the world beyond their desperate daily struggle for survival. And Maria Elena herself, for the first time since her father's accident, had the chance to be something more than just a survivor. She had the chance to build something, to learn, to grow into the kind of person who could take on real responsibility and succeed. The moldy apples that had started it all seemed like a symbol now, a reminder that sometimes the things other people throw away can become the foundation for something beautiful and unexpected. As she turned to go inside and begin the first night of their new life, Maria Elena made a silent promise to herself and to the man who had given them this chance. She would work harder than he expected, learn faster than he thought possible, and prove that his investment in a desperate girl and her 3 siblings was the best decision he had ever made. The future stretched out ahead of them like the vast landscape of the ranch itself, full of possibilities, challenges, and the kind of hope that comes from knowing that tomorrow will bring opportunities rather than just the struggle to make it through another day. The alarm clock's shrill ring pierced the pre-dawn darkness at 4:30, but Maria Elena had been awake for 20 minutes already, staring at the ceiling of her new bedroom and running through the day's schedule in her mind. 3 months had passed since their arrival at the Morrison Ranch, and the rhythm of ranch life had become as familiar as breathing. Every morning began the same way: early rising, quick breakfast preparation, and the walk across the dewy grass to the main barn where David Morrison would already be checking on the cattle and reviewing the day's priorities. She dressed quickly in the sturdy work clothes that had replaced her threadbare dresses, clothes that were designed for functionality rather than appearance, but that fit properly and were clean and whole. The transformation in their material circumstances was still something that occasionally took her breath away: 3 meals a day, clothing that didn't need constant mending, shoes that protected her feet from the ground rather than barely covering them. But the changes went deeper than material comfort. Maria Elena had discovered that she had a natural aptitude for the complex problem-solving that ranch management required. The interconnected systems that David Morrison had described during their first tour: cattle, crops, land management, weather patterns, market fluctuations, had initially seemed overwhelming in their complexity. Now she found herself thinking about these systems instinctively, seeing connections and patterns that allowed her to anticipate problems before they became crises. In the kitchen, she prepared a quick breakfast for herself and left plates warming in the oven for her siblings, who would wake up in another hour to get ready for school. The local school had welcomed them without question, and all 3 children were thriving in ways that sometimes brought tears to Maria Elena's eyes. Anna had tested into advanced reading groups and was already talking about wanting to study literature in high school. Carlos had discovered an aptitude for mathematics and science that his teachers said was exceptional. Even Miguel, the youngest, had adapted to the structure and stimulation of formal education, with an enthusiasm that suggested he might be the scholar of the family. The walk to the main barn took her past the vegetable gardens, where she had learned to coordinate crop rotation schedules, the equipment shed, where she now knew the maintenance requirements for every piece of machinery, and the small office building, where she spent her afternoons learning the business side of ranch operations from computer spreadsheets and market reports that had initially seemed like puzzles written in a foreign language. David Morrison was waiting for her in the barn's main corridor, clipboard in hand, and wearing the expression of quiet concentration that meant something unusual was happening. After 3 months of working together, Maria Elena had learned to read his moods and expressions, and she could tell immediately that this morning would bring challenges beyond the routine tasks of feeding, health checks, and pasture management. "Good morning," she said, accepting the cup of coffee he handed her and automatically scanning the row of stalls to check for any obvious problems. The cattle were calm and alert, which ruled out immediate health crises, but something in David Morrison's posture suggested complications of a different sort. "Morning," he replied. "We need to talk about the Henderson property." Maria Elena nodded, though the name didn't immediately mean anything to her. After 3 months of intensive education in ranch operations, she was familiar with their own land and the neighboring properties that shared fence lines or water rights, but the broader network of local landowners was still being mapped in her mind. "The ranch about 5 miles north of here," David Morrison continued, seeing her momentary confusion. "James Henderson died last week, heart attack, and his nephew from Phoenix is handling the estate. He wants to sell the land as quickly as possible, and he's not interested in maintaining it as a working ranch." The implications hit Maria Elena immediately. A neighboring ranch changing hands could affect everything from water access to cattle management, depending on what the new owners planned to do with the land. But something in David Morrison's tone suggested that this particular situation was more significant than a simple change in ownership. "What kind of buyer is he looking for?" she asked, already suspecting that the answer would explain his concern. "Developers," David Morrison said grimly. "The nephew has been in contact with several companies that want to build residential subdivisions. 500 homes on quarter-acre lots, complete with shopping center, and what they're calling a recreational vehicle park." Maria Elena felt her stomach drop. The Henderson property bordered their land along nearly 2 miles of fence line, including the section that contained the natural spring that fed their cattle watering system during the dry summer months. More than that, the quiet, rural character that made the ranch feel like a sanctuary would be destroyed by the kind of development David Morrison was describing. "Is there anything we can do to stop it?" she asked. David Morrison was quiet for a moment, and Maria Elena realized that this wasn't just a casual conversation about local land use. This was a business discussion about a decision that would affect the future of the ranch and everyone who depended on it. "We could buy it ourselves," he said finally. "The nephew is asking a fair price for agricultural land, though it's still a substantial investment. Adding Henderson's 1,200 acres to our operation would solve several problems we've been discussing. It would give us room to expand the cattle operation, provide better winter grazing, and secure our water rights permanently." The idea was exciting and terrifying at the same time. Maria Elena had been learning about the financial side of ranch operations, and she understood that an investment of this magnitude would require careful planning and significant risk. But she also understood that some opportunities only presented themselves once, and that the cost of missing this opportunity might be greater than the cost of taking it. "What would it mean for the ranch?" she asked. "In practical terms, how would we manage that much additional land?" "That's exactly the question I was hoping you'd ask," David Morrison said with the first smile she had seen from him that morning. "Because the answer is that we couldn't manage it with our current staffing levels. We'd need to hire additional help, which means we'd need to expand the housing facilities, upgrade some of our equipment, and restructure the management system to handle a larger operation." Maria Elena felt a familiar flutter of excitement in her chest, the same feeling she got when David Morrison introduced new challenges that stretched her understanding and abilities. Over the past 3 months, She had discovered that she thrived on complexity, that the bigger and more intricate the puzzle, the more engaged and energetic she became in solving it. "Have you already made a decision?" she asked. "No," David Morrison said. "This is the kind of choice that affects everyone on the ranch, and I want to make it thoughtfully. But I need your perspective on whether you think we're ready for this kind of expansion." The fact that he was asking for her opinion, rather than simply informing her of his decision, was another reminder of how dramatically her role had evolved since their first meeting. She was no longer just an employee learning to follow instructions, but a trusted advisor whose judgment he valued in making decisions that would shape the ranch's future. They spent the next hour walking the sections of fence line that bordered the Henderson property, assessing the condition of the land and discussing the practical implications of incorporating it into their operation. The property was well maintained and included several features that would be valuable additions: a second barn, additional equipment storage, and most importantly, the natural spring that fed a creek running through both properties. "The water rights alone make this worth considering," David Morrison said as they stood beside the spring, watching the clear water bubble up from deep underground. "Having guaranteed water access means we could weather even severe drought years without having to reduce our cattle numbers or depend entirely on well water." Maria Elena knelt beside the spring and let the cold water run over her fingers, thinking about the interconnected systems that made ranch operations possible. Water, land, cattle, crops, markets. Whether each element affected all the others, and successful management meant understanding those connections well enough to make decisions that strengthened the entire system rather than optimizing any single part. "If we don't buy it," she said slowly, "and it gets developed the way the nephew wants, what happens to our operation?" "We survive," David Morrison said honestly. "But we lose opportunities for growth, and we have to adapt to having 500 families as neighbors instead of cattle and open land. That means noise, traffic, increased regulation, and probably pressure from the homeowners association about agricultural practices they consider unsightly or inconvenient." The picture he painted was depressing, but Maria Elena found herself thinking beyond the immediate problems to the broader implications. "And if we do buy it, what would success look like 5 years from now?" David Morrison smiled, and she could see him visualizing the same future possibilities that were taking shape in her own mind. 1,500 acres under integrated management, a cattle operation large enough to achieve real economies of scale, expanded fruit cultivation, maybe even agritourism if we decide to go that direction. Most importantly, a working ranch that demonstrates sustainable agriculture practices on a scale that could influence how other operations approach land management. They walked back toward the main ranch buildings in comfortable silence, each lost in thought about the decision that lay ahead. Maria Elena found herself thinking not just about the immediate practical considerations, but about what this expansion would mean for her own future and that of her siblings. A larger operation would require more sophisticated management, which meant more learning opportunities and greater responsibilities. It would also mean greater financial success, which could translate into educational opportunities for Carlos, Ana, and Miguel that she had never dared to consider possible. But it would also mean greater pressure, higher stakes, and the possibility that failure could affect not just their family but David Morrison's life's work as well. The weight of that responsibility was sobering, even as the possibilities excited her. Back at the main barn, they found Carlos waiting for them, dressed for school but obviously hopping to catch them before they disappeared into their morning work routine. At 11, he had become fascinated with the technical aspects of ranch operations, and often asked questions that demonstrated a natural understanding of mechanical systems and problem-solving approaches. "David," he said, using the informal address that all the children had adopted, "the water pressure in the guest house bathroom was really low this morning. Should I check the connections, or is there something else that might cause that?" Maria Elena felt a familiar surge of pride at her brother's practical intelligence and willingness to contribute to the household's smooth operation. All three of her siblings had adapted to ranch life by finding ways to be helpful rather than simply accepting the benefits of their new circumstances. "Good observation," David Morrison replied seriously. "Low water pressure usually means either a blockage somewhere in the line or a problem with the pump system. Why don't you check the obvious things, faucet aerators, shower heads? And if those look clear, we'll inspect the main lines this weekend. Carlos nodded eagerly and headed off toward the school bus stop, clearly pleased to have a technical mystery to solve. Maria Elena watched him go and thought about how much all of them had changed in just 3 months. Carlos was more confident and engaged. Ana was visibly happier and more intellectual curious, and Miguel had developed a security and contentment that made him seem older and more mature despite still being only 6 years old. "They're thriving here," David Morrison observed, clearly following her thoughts. "Yes," Maria Elena said. "Sometimes I can't believe how much they've grown and changed. It's like they were just waiting for the opportunity to become who they were meant to be." "That's not just the children," David Morrison said quietly. "You've changed just as much, though you may not realize it. The girl who was stealing apples 3 months ago was smart and determined and resourceful, but she was also scared and overwhelmed by circumstances beyond her control. The young woman standing here now is confident, knowledgeable, and ready to take on challenges that would intimidate most adults." Maria Elena felt herself blushing at the praise, but she also recognized the truth in what he was saying. The constant anxiety that had characterized her life for so many months had been replaced by a sense of purpose and capability that made even difficult problems feel manageable. She had discovered strengths and abilities that she hadn't known she possessed, and every successful challenge built her confidence for the next one. "Speaking of challenges," David Morrison continued, "there's something else we need to discuss about the Henderson property situation. The nephew wants an answer within 2 weeks, which means we need to make a decision quickly. But before we can commit to the purchase, we need to have a solid plan for managing the expanded operation." "What kind of plan?" Maria Elena asked, though she suspected she already knew where this conversation was leading. "A staffing plan, primarily. We'd need to hire at least 2 additional full-time workers, probably 3 during busy seasons. That means we'd need to expand the employee housing, develop training programs, and restructure the management hierarchy to handle delegation and supervision effectively." The implications were clear, and Maria Elena felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness as she considered what David Morrison was really saying. An expanded operation would require expanded management, and there was only one person on the ranch who had both the knowledge and the trust necessary to take on that kind of responsibility. "You're talking about promoting me," she said. "I'm talking about recognizing what's already happened," David Morrison corrected. "Over the past 3 months, you become my partner in running this ranch rather than just an employee learning the basics. If we expand, that partnership becomes even more important." The word partner hung in the air between them, carrying implications that went far beyond job titles or salary increases. Partnership meant shared responsibility, shared risk, and shared ownership of both success and failure. It meant that David Morrison trusted her judgment enough to stake his ranch's future on decisions they would make together. "I want to do it," Maria Elena said, surprising herself with how quickly and certainly the words came. "The expansion, the additional responsibility, all of it, but I need to know that you're confident in my abilities, not just hopeful about them." David Morrison studied her face carefully, and she could see him evaluating not just her words but her posture, her tone of voice, and the steady confidence in her eyes that had replaced the fearful uncertainty he had first encountered. "3 months ago," he said finally, "you were a desperate girl trying to keep her family alive by stealing fruit that other people had thrown away. Today, you're asking me to trust you with decisions that could make or break a multi-million-dollar operation. That transformation didn't happen by accident, and it didn't happen because I felt sorry for your circumstances. It happened because you have exactly the kind of character and intelligence that success requires." "Then let's do it," Maria Elena said. "Let's buy the Henderson property and build something bigger than either of us could manage alone." As they shook hands on the decision, Maria Elena thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. 6 months ago, she couldn't have imagined a future that extended beyond the next meal or the next day's survival. Now she was planning expansions and improvements that would unfold over years, building something that would provide security and opportunity not just for her own family, but for the additional employees they would hire and the broader community that depended on successful local agriculture. The moldy apples that had started everything seemed like a symbol from another lifetime, a reminder of how desperate circumstances could become the foundation for unexpected opportunities if you were brave enough to take risks, and wise enough to recognize when someone was offering you more than just temporary help. But more than that, they were a reminder that sometimes the things other people consider worthless, damaged fruit, a struggling family, a girl with no experience and no resources except her own determination, can become the most valuable assets in the right circumstances. As Maria Elena headed back toward the guest house to check on her siblings' morning routines, she thought about the conversation she would have with them that evening about the changes that lay ahead. Carlos would be excited about the technical challenges of managing a larger operation. Anna would want to know about the environmental implications of sustainable agriculture practiced on a larger scale. Miguel would mostly be concerned about whether their new responsibilities would interfere with story time before bed. All of them would understand, in their own ways, that their family's extraordinary journey was far from over. The girl who had stolen moldy apples to feed her siblings was becoming a woman who could manage thousands of acres and dozens of employees. The children who had once wondered if they would be hungry tomorrow were now thinking about college educations and career possibilities that stretched far beyond anything their previous circumstances had suggested. And at the center of it all was the simple truth that David Morrison had seen from the beginning, that character and determination were more valuable than experience or credentials, and that the right people in the right circumstances could accomplish far more than anyone would have thought possible. The future they were building together would be complex and challenging, full of risks and uncertainties that would test everything they had learned and everything they were still learning. But it would also be theirs in a way that their previous life never could have been, built on choices they made together and sustained by abilities they had discovered in themselves. As the sun climbed higher over the rolling hills of the ranch, Maria Elena felt the familiar satisfaction of work that mattered, responsibilities that challenged her, and the knowledge that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to prove that David Morrison's faith in a desperate girl and her 3 siblings had been the best investment he had ever made. The county courthouse was an imposing building of red brick and white columns that seemed designed to intimidate people who weren't used to dealing with legal proceedings and official paperwork. Maria Elena sat in the uncomfortable wooden chair outside the courtroom, smoothing her best dress with nervous hands and trying to calm the anxiety that had been building for weeks since they first received the official notice about the custody hearing. 18 months had passed since their arrival at the Morrison Ranch, and in that time, their lives had been transformed in ways that still sometimes felt like a dream. The Henderson property purchase had been completed successfully, making David Morrison one of the largest landowners in the county and establishing Maria Elena as the youngest ranch manager in the region. The operation now employed 6 full-time workers and seasonal staff that brought the total to nearly 15 people during busy periods. More importantly, all 3 of her siblings were thriving in ways that exceeded her most optimistic hopes from those desperate days in the trailer. But success, she had learned, sometimes brought unexpected complications. 3 weeks ago, a social worker named Patricia Holbrook had appeared at the ranch with questions about the children's living arrangements and Maria Elena's legal status as their guardian. Someone had filed a report claiming that minors were living without proper adult supervision, and the state was required to investigate any such allegations. The irony was bitter. For 18 months, the children had been safer, healthier, and more stable than they had ever been in their lives. Carlos, now 13, was earning straight A's in advanced mathematics and had been accepted into a summer program for gifted students. Anna, 11, was reading at a high school level and had won the county spelling bee. Miguel, 7, was a confident, happy child who spoke enthusiastically about his friends at school and his plans to become a veterinarian so he could take care of the ranch's animals. But none of that mattered to the bureaucratic machinery that had been set in motion. Because Maria Elena was only 16 and not their legal guardian, the state considered the children to be living in an unsupervised arrangement that violated child welfare regulations. The fact that David Morrison provided oversight and that the children were obviously flourishing was irrelevant to the technical requirements of the law. Miss Vasquez, the court clerk's voice interrupted her dark thoughts. Judge Harrison will see you now. Maria Elena stood on unsteady legs and walked into the courtroom, where David Morrison was already seated at a table with their lawyer, a woman named Janet Rodriguez who specialized in family law and had been recommended by the bank president who handled the ranch's finances. Across the room, Patricia Holbrook sat with a state attorney, surrounded by folders full of documents that supposedly justified breaking up their family. Judge Harrison was a middle-aged woman with graying hair and tired eyes that suggested she had seen too many cases where good intentions collided with legal requirements. She looked up from the paperwork spread across her desk and studied Maria Elena with an expression that was serious but not unkind. "Miss Vasquez," she began, "I've reviewed the social worker's report and the documentation provided by your attorney. Before I make any decisions about the placement of your siblings, I want to hear from you directly about your current living situation." Maria Elena had practiced this moment for days, rehearsing the points that Janet Rodriguez had told her were most important to emphasize. But standing in the formal courtroom, facing a judge who held her family's future in her hands, all her prepared remarks seemed inadequate to convey the reality of what they had built together. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steadier than she felt, "my siblings and I came to the Morrison Ranch 18 months ago after our father abandoned us and we were living in poverty. Since then, we've had stable housing, regular meals, excellent schooling, and medical care. We've built a life there that has allowed all of us to grow and succeed in ways that wouldn't have been possible in our previous circumstances." "I understand that," Judge Harrison said gently. "But the issue before this court isn't whether you and your siblings are happy or successful in your current arrangement. The issue is whether that arrangement meets the legal requirements for child welfare and protection." Maria Elena felt her heart sink as she recognized the same bureaucratic logic that Patricia Hallbrook had used during her interviews. The law was designed to protect children from neglect and abuse, but it apparently couldn't account for situations where unconventional arrangements actually provided better care than traditional alternatives. "However," Judge Harrison continued, "I'm also aware that the law allows for some flexibility in cases where alternative arrangements serve the best interests of the children involved. Mrs. Rodriguez, I understand you have a proposal for how this situation might be resolved without disrupting the children's current placement." Janet Rodriguez stood up, and Maria Elena felt a flutter of hope. Over the past weeks, their lawyer had been working on what she called a creative solution to the custody problem, but she had been vague about the details, saying only that it would require cooperation from several different parties and approval from the court. "Yes, Your Honor," Janet Rodriguez said. "We're proposing a formal guardianship arrangement that would address the court's concerns about supervision while allowing the children to remain in their current stable environment." She opened a folder and withdrew several documents. "Mr. David Morrison, who owns and operates the ranch where the family currently lives, is willing to petition for legal guardianship of all 3 minor children. He has been providing housing, financial support, and supervision for the past 18 months. And he meets all the legal requirements for serving as a guardian." Maria Elena turned to look at David Morrison, shocked by this news. They had discussed the custody hearing many times, but he had never mentioned the possibility of formally adopting or taking guardianship of her siblings. The idea that he would be willing to take on that level of legal responsibility was both overwhelming and deeply moving. Judge Harrison was examining the documents with careful attention. "Mr. Morrison," she said, "legal guardianship is a serious commitment that would make you responsible for these children's welfare until they reach adulthood. Are you prepared for that responsibility?" David Morrison stood up, and when he spoke, his voice carried the same quiet certainty that Maria Elena had come to associate with his most important decisions. "Your Honor, these children have been part of my household for 18 months. They're not just residents on my property, they're family. Formalizing that relationship through legal guardianship simply acknowledges what's already true." "And Miss Vasquez," Judge Harrison said, turning back to Maria Elena, "how do you feel about this arrangement? You've been caring for your siblings independently for a considerable time. Are you comfortable with Mr. Morrison assuming legal responsibility for their welfare?" It was a complex question that touched on fears and hopes that Maria Elena had been struggling with throughout the custody proceedings. Part of her was reluctant to give up the role she had fought so hard to fill, the identity she had built around being the one who protected and provided for Carlos, Ana, and Miguel. But a larger part of her recognized that accepting David Morrison's guardianship would give her siblings security and opportunities that she could never provide on her own. "Mr. Morrison has been more than an employer to our family," she said carefully. "He's been a mentor, a protector, and a friend. My siblings trust him completely, and so do I if legal guardianship is what's required to keep our family together and allow us to continue building the life we've created at the ranch. Then I support it completely. Judge Harrison made notes on the documents before her and was quiet for a long moment. When she looked up, her expression was thoughtful rather than skeptical, and Maria Elena dared to hope that the hearing might end favorably. Mrs. Holbrook, the judge said, addressing the social worker, what is your assessment of the proposed guardianship arrangement? Patricia Holbrook consulted her own files before responding. Your Honor, my investigation of the Morrison Ranch confirmed that the children are living in excellent conditions. They're well fed, properly housed, receiving good medical care, and performing above grade level in school. Mr. Morrison has substantial financial resources and an established relationship with the children. From a practical standpoint, this guardianship arrangement would address all of the concerns that prompted the initial investigation. However, she continued, and Maria Elena felt her stomach drop at the word, I do have some concerns about the unusual nature of this family structure. Miss Vasquez would continue to function as the primary caregiver for her siblings, but she would not have legal authority over important decisions regarding their welfare. This could create confusion about roles and responsibilities. Judge Harrison nodded thoughtfully. That's a valid concern. Mrs. Rodriguez, how would your clients address the potential complications Mrs. Holbrook has identified? Janet Rodriguez was ready with an answer that suggested she had anticipated this question. Your Honor, we're proposing a guardianship arrangement that formally recognizes Miss Vasquez's role as a co-caregiver with specific authority over day-to-day decisions regarding her siblings' care. The legal guardianship would provide oversight and ultimate responsibility, but the practical caregiving arrangements would continue much as they have been. It was an elegant solution that acknowledged both Maria Elena's demonstrated competence and the legal system's need for adult oversight. Judge Harrison seemed to approve of the proposal, but Maria Elena could see that she still had concerns about approving an arrangement that was outside the normal patterns of child custody law. I'm going to call a brief recess, Judge Harrison announced, to review all the documentation more thoroughly. During that time, I'd like to speak individually with each of the minor children to get their perspective on this proposed arrangement. Maria Elena's heart pounded as she realized that Carlos, Ana, and Miguel would now have to speak for themselves about their future. They had been waiting in a separate room with a court advocate, and she wondered how they would handle the pressure of speaking to a judge about such important matters. During the recess, David Morrison approached her with an expression of concern and reassurance. Are you all right? He asked quietly. I know this is stressful, and I want you to know that regardless of how the judge rules, we'll find a way to keep your family together. Why didn't you tell me you were planning to petition for guardianship? Maria Elena asked. I mean, I'm grateful, but it's a huge commitment. You could be legally responsible for 3 children for the next 10 years or more. David Morrison was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a depth of emotion that she rarely heard from him. Maria Elena, 18 months ago, you were stealing rotting apples to feed your siblings because you refused to let your family be broken up. You were willing to sacrifice everything to keep them safe and together. Did you really think I would do less when they became part of my family, too? The simple honesty of his answer brought tears to her eyes, and she realized that somewhere during the months of working together, learning together, and building something bigger than either of them could have managed alone, David Morrison had indeed become family in a way that went beyond employment or even friendship. When court reconvened, Judge Harrison's expression was more relaxed than it had been earlier. I've spoken with Carlos, Ana, and Miguel Vasquez, she announced, and their feelings about their current living situation are unambiguous. All 3 children expressed strong affection for Mr. Morrison and absolute confidence in their sister's continued role as their primary caregiver. They understand the proposed guardianship arrangement and support it enthusiastically. Maria Elena felt a wave of relief mixed with pride in her siblings' maturity and articulation. Despite their young ages, they had apparently been able to communicate clearly about complex family dynamics and legal arrangements. Furthermore, Judge Harrison continued, the court's investigation has confirmed that the children are thriving in their current environment in ways that suggest this arrangement serves their best interests remarkably well. While the family structure is unconventional, the results speak for themselves. She shuffled through the papers one more time before making her final pronouncement. Therefore, this court approves Mr. Morrison's petition for guardianship of Carlos, Ana, and Miguel Vasquez, with the understanding that Miss Maria Elena Vasquez will continue to serve as primary caregiver under Mr. Morrison's legal oversight. The arrangement will be reviewed annually to ensure that it continues to serve the children's best interests. The relief that flooded through Maria Elena was so intense that she had to grip the edge of the table to keep from collapsing. It was over. Her family would stay together. The life they had built at the ranch could continue and grow. The future that had seemed so precarious just hours before was now legally protected and officially recognized. As they left the courthouse, Maria Elena found herself thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. The desperate girl who had stolen moldy apples to quiet her siblings' cries had become a young woman whose family was now legally protected and whose own future stretched out ahead of her filled with possibilities she was still discovering. But more than that, she had learned something profound about the nature of family and the different forms that love and commitment could take. David Morrison's willingness to assume legal responsibility for 3 children who weren't his own was more than generosity. It was a recognition that family bonds could be chosen and built rather than just inherited. That evening, as they celebrated the court's decision with a special dinner prepared by Carlos, who had developed into an excellent cook, Maria Elena looked around the table at the people who made up her chosen family. David Morrison, discussing cattle genetics with 13-year-old Carlos as if he were a peer. Ana, reading aloud from a book about environmental science, while Miguel listened with rapt attention. The easy conversation and comfortable silences that spoke of people who belonged together. The moldy apples that had started it all seemed like a symbol of transformation, something that appeared worthless and discarded, but that contained the seeds of unexpected abundance. Just as those damaged fruits had sustained her family during their darkest period, the desperate circumstances that had driven her to steal them had ultimately led to opportunities and security beyond anything she could have imagined. But the real lesson, she realized, wasn't about transformation or redemption or the power of hard work to change circumstances. It was about recognition, David Morrison's ability to see potential where others saw only problems, her own growing recognition of abilities and strengths she hadn't known she possessed, and the court's eventual recognition that families could be built through choice and commitment rather than just biology. As she tucked Miguel into bed that night, listening to his excited chatter about school projects and ranch animals, and all the things that made up his secure, happy world, Maria Elena thought about the promise David Morrison had made to him on their first day at the ranch. "You will never be hungry again." It had been true in ways that went far beyond food. None of them would ever again hunger for safety, for opportunity, for the knowledge that they belonged somewhere and mattered to people who would fight to protect what they had built together. The girl who had once crept through orchards in the pre-dawn darkness, collecting discarded fruit and hopping not to be caught, was now a young woman with legal authority over thousands of acres, responsibility for dozens of employees, and a family that had been formally recognized by the state as worthy of protection and support. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The ranch was growing rapidly, and with growth came complexities that would test everything she had learned about management, problem-solving, and leadership. But tonight, as she listened to the peaceful sounds of her siblings sleeping safely in their own bedrooms, Maria Elena knew that they had built something that could withstand whatever challenges lay ahead. The future they were creating together was bigger than any of them could have imagined when David Morrison first knocked on the door of their cramped trailer with his unexpected offer of employment and hope. And at the center of it all was the simple truth that sometimes the most valuable things begin with what others consider worthless, and that the greatest transformations happen when someone has the wisdom to see potential where others see only problems.